Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz, first reminding you that for 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, and connecting high school and college students to Israel. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. All right, as for this episode, it's a true honor to welcome Professor Gil Troy to the program. Designated an Allgemeiner J100, that means one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life, Professor Troy is a distinguished scholar of North American history at McGill University and the author of 9 books on American history and 3 books on Zionism. His latest book, Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People, is co-authored with Natan Sharansky and is available wherever you like to buy your books. And with that, it's an absolute honor to welcome Gil Troy to IsraelCast, who joins us now via Zoom from his home office in Jerusalem. Gil, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
All right, listen, we've got so many bases to cover, and I'd really just like to dive in right now because, as you know, Jewish National Fund USA has launched a year-long campaign called Conversations on Zionism, Reclaiming the Narrative. You've joined in the conversations with Jewish National Fund USA CEO Russell Robinson. You were a guest on the series In Conversation with him, and I urge all our listeners to tune into that chat. It's on Jewish National Fund's Zionism Studios YouTube channel. Please subscribe. And that's where you can get all the conversations as well as all IsraelCast episodes. So really, for the sake of framing our conversation, Gil, I'd like you to share first and foremost your definition of Zionism and really, Gil, what Zionism means to you.
So first, let me thank you, and let me thank Russell Robinson, and let me thank JNF USA for taking on this important task, because we really have to take back the night. It's insane that there's one form of nationalism, Jewish nationalism, that is singled out and demonized, delegitimized, disrespected, tagged with the ugliest words in the international vocabulary, be it racism or colonialism or imperialism. And we really have to not just be defensive. We can't just be anti-Zionists or anti-Semites. We have to take back the night and reaffirm Zionism and say loud and proud, I am a Zionist. So what is a Zionist? Very simple. 3-part definition. A Zionist is someone who, first of all, understands that the Jews are not just a religion of Judaism, not just adherents of a faith community, but also members of a people, a nation. And that's why we can have a Jewish state that isn't a theocracy. And that's why I always say that Judaism is an Oreo cookie, because just like the Oreo cookie has a cookie part and a cream part, and that's what makes it the Oreo cookie. It's the most popular cookie in the world. I read that on the internet, and everything on the internet is true, as you know. So too, Judaism is this mix of nation and religion. And does that confuse some people who want to box us either into a religious box or a national box? I'm sorry, that's our reality. So 1, Zionism says we are a people. 2, that we have ties to a particular homeland, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. That doesn't mean that others might not have ties to that land. I grew up in New York, and of course, we were very proud Americans, but we knew that Native Americans also had a certain tie to Manhattan. But that doesn't negate our tie. And we, of course, have the longer and more historic tie. We are the original Aboriginal people. So A, we are a people as well as a religion. B, we have ties to a particular homeland. And C, like 192 other countries in the United Nations today, we have the right to establish a state on that land. And that expresses our peopledom, that expresses our nationhood, that expresses our identity. So it's basically, in Hebrew, Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel.
And that's the Oreo cookie, as you described.
That is the Oreo cookie, right. And right. That is the essential statement about Zionism. And it's, of course, important, based on that definition, to build a big, broad tent from left to right, religious, non-religious, and say, this is our platform, our liberal nationalist platform. And are there juggling acts? Of course. But within that, we have room to express ourselves. And and one of the exciting things about JNF is that it's an expression of environmental Zionism and political Zionism and what I call identity Zionism. And some might approach JNF from a religious perspective, religious Zionism, and certainly the love of the land, labor Zionism. And so all these different kinds of Zionisms come and mix together in the same way that we have slightly different accents, but ultimately might be speaking the same language. So too, we have different forms of Zionism, but are fundamentally united by a sense of peoplehood, connection to the homeland, and an expression of that peoplehood and that homeland in the state.
So why and how then has Zionism become such a dirty word in your mind?
I hate this explanation that I'm going to give, but just as anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, was called by the late great historian Robert Wistrich the oldest hatred, it's also the most plastic hatred. Think about it. Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, for thousands of years has morphed. And we've even seen it in the last few decades. When racism is unpopular, all of a sudden Zionism becomes racism, even though we have dark-skinned Jews and light-skinned Jews, even though there are dark-skinned Israelis and light-skinned Palestinians. It's not a racial conflict. When imperialism is unpopular, we say, oh, Zionists, they say Zionists are imperialists, even though where's the empire? Zionism, we're now told, is settler colonialism. But doesn't colonialism require a home country, a mother country? And isn't Israel our mother country? Aren't we the original mother country people? Isn't it our fatherland, our homeland? So how can we be colonialists? You want to criticize us? Fine. But why do we somehow morph and take on all these forms? And it gets worse. Look at the last 2-3 years. COVID breaks out, and all of a sudden there's a meme, COVID 48. Jews are somehow responsible for this great, horrific disease. George Floyd is killed in a horrific act of American police brutality. And then there's all of a sudden this assumption that Israel, the IDF, taught the American police how to be racist, how to have police brutality, as if some American policemen and women need training from Jews, from Israelis, in how to be racist. It doesn't make sense. And the great late senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, said, I'm not interested in the accused. Everybody who says, what's wrong with Israel? What's wrong with Zionists? They're attacked. He says, I'm interested in the accuser. What's wrong with you? And who are Israel's enemies? Racists, bigots, anti-Semites, anti-democrats, people who are totalitarian in their thought. And Franklin Roosevelt, I'm an American historian, so I have many American references, said, judge me by the enemies I make. When I look at that long list of people who hate Israel, I'm okay with it. I judge us by our enemies. But I also say, why such enmity? It only is explained by this longest hatred, this most plastic hatred, this Jew hatred, which is unfortunately deep within Christian civilization and deep within Muslim civilization. And even as we've seen much of Christianity and the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church escape from it, it still hovers like this ugly cloud. And whereas once it was the individual Jew who was singled out, now it's the collective Jew, Israel, the state of Israel, the Zionists who are singled out.
Isn't it not intellectually dishonest, Gil, on the media's part, for example, not to put into context the story of Israel? I mean, say, for example, with the last engagement that happened with Gaza. And I'm wondering if you can just address that, because, I don't necessarily think that journalists are evil people or bad people, but there's something underlying there. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Look, we live in a world of sloppiness. We live in a world of Twitterdom. We live in, and I spell Twitterdom D-U-M-B. We live in a world where complex arguments, complex historical forces must be explained in 240 characters. And yeah, I always say as a historian, what's my favorite text? Context. And how can you explain what's going on in the Middle East without explaining the Jewish desire to return to our homeland because we had been kicked out, because we were in exile, because when we weren't there, we were everyone's favorite target? How can you explain what's going on in the Middle East in 2021 without talking about Israel's many efforts at peace? How can you explain what's happening this month without talking about the fact that we're about to celebrate a year of the Abraham Accords? And how can you call Israelis racist or bigoted against Arabs when you see the excitement, the love, the investment, the cultural ties that bubbled over as soon as we had a peace partner in the United Arab Emirates, in Bahrain, in Morocco? And so we see, It's not that Israelis have this hostility toward Arabs. Israelis have this desire to live. And when bombs are being launched from Gaza, which we withdrew from in 2005, we have the right to defend ourselves. And so, yes, it's complicated. I always say that if I can get someone to understand that it's not black and white, that it's gray, it's okay. When people say, hallelujah, I see the light, even if they hear me and they say, oh, I love your speech, hallelujah, I see the light, I say, don't see the light, because somebody else is going to come. They're going to be better looking than I, they're going to have more hair than I have, they're going to have better sense of humor than I have. And you'll say, I see that light, see the grays. Once you accept that there's complexity, then you can see our side of the story and pick out the blue and white threads. Does that mean Israel's always perfect? No. Does that mean that Israel have a legitimate claim to self-defense? Absolutely. And then if I can just add one more thing, as an academic, when I see how my fellow academics can walk into a Starbucks and make anything complex, right? So they could make the act of drinking coffee an economic situation. How do you get $1 worth of coffee and charge $6? How do you explain the anthropology of Starbucks, the sociology of Starbucks, and on, and make it so complex? And then come to the Middle East with all our complexity here and reduce it to Zionism, racism, Israel apartheid, to these one-word or these one-line slogans. That doesn't pass the smell test. And when you break out of your character in order to single out the Jew or the Jewish state, unfortunately, we know what that is. It's a historic pattern. It's a historic disease. It's called Jew hatred, anti-Semitism.
And Gil, can you also talk about this notion of differing perceptions of history? In other words, I think that we in the United States, we like to look at problems as being able to be solved within a matter of a couple of years or an election cycle, right? But in the Middle East, it's a very different approach. Or in East Asia, it's a very different approach. They look at history in terms of over centuries, whereas we look at it in terms of just years or decades or minutes.
All right, so stepping away from the conflict for a second, look, one of the beautiful things about living in Israel and visiting Israel is that when you're in the United States, indeed, you count in decades. I'm an American historian. I teach about the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. I come to Europe and we start counting in the centuries, right? You're in England, you're thinking about the 12th century, the 15th century, the 18th century. And you come to Israel and you're thinking in millennia. And that's very, very powerful. But that means that sometimes the forces that are clashing are also counting in millennia. And so the Palestinians, the extremists, not every Palestinian, will say, well, the Crusaders came and went, we're treating these Jews like the Crusaders. But one of the powerful things about the Abraham Accords, and one of the powerful things about the things that have gone on in the last few decades, is I think we have to add an S to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and not talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, talk about the Arab-Israeli conflicts. Since 1973, since the end of the Yom Kippur War, we haven't had Arab armies trying to wipe out Israel because they saw that doesn't work. In the last year, we've seen what happens when you have people-to-people ties and the excitement, as I said, of investment, cultural ties, tourism. So that's a different conflict. We see everybody thinks, oh, Israel's a pariah state, but Israel has over 160 countries that recognize it. So we have to say that within all these different conflicts, there's been tremendous progress. There's one conflict of the Arab-Israeli conflicts that continues to be a major sticking point, and that's the Palestinian conflict. But the more peace we have, and that's why I don't say peace now, I say peace more. The more we solve all the conflicts around what's emerging as the core conflict, the better chance we have to solve the conflict. And yes, it takes time. And Americans have to have patience, and American Jews have to have patience, because sometimes they're the most impatient, the most gullible when they hear Palestinian propaganda, the weakest when it comes to standing up to these forces that claim that Israel is somehow an apartheid state. And I should say not all American Jews, of course, look at the amazing work that you holy people do in JNF, but a very small, loud, shrill minority that gets far too much attention.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. You know, I always like to look at history as sort of like the cha-cha-cha, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. And so that's probably just one approach to take. I want to go back to this notion of Zionism, though, because, Gil, we had Zionist Vera Gulyash here on a recent episode of IsraelCast, and we talked about the term pro-Israel, and would really love your take on it, because you can be pro-Israel, which, dare I say, sometimes implies that you're anti-something else, which then translates into anti-Palestinian. So where do you fall on that?
So first of all, as I said, in my core definition of Zionism, I have enough room in my heart. And frankly, as an ardent American nationalist and an ardent Jewish nationalist, I have enough understanding of the power of nationalism to acknowledge this phenomenon called Palestinian nationalism. And to say that I understand that Palestinians have a certain story and they have a certain connection to this land that I love. But what I don't understand is why so much energy of Palestinian nationalism is devoted to negating us rather than building themselves up. Why is the highlight of the Palestinian year on campus not pro-Palestinian Day, not Israel-Palestinian Peace Day, but a lie called Israel Apartheid Week? Why is there so much energy in the Palestinian national camp that essentially says to be pro-Palestinian is not just to be anti-Israeli, but to be anti-Jew? So I don't accept the notion that by being a Zionist, I'm negating or disrespecting Palestinians. And I don't accept the notion that by being pro-Israel, I'm negating Palestinians. In fact, as I say, there's lots of room in my heart for all kinds of forms of nationalism. But I also know that, not having spent many years in Canada, where Quebec nationalism is a very vibrant and vital force, but it's not expressed in a formal state. So it doesn't necessarily mean just because you have respect for nationalism that it's necessarily going to lead to a state. But let me tell you, the best way to lead to a state is not to negate an existing state. And the problem with too much Palestinian nationalism and too many Palestinian leaders is that in their DNA right now is this negationist notion, whereas since the 1990s, most Israelis, most Zionists, most Jews accept a Palestinian narrative, accept the notion that there is a Palestinian people and they won't disappear. So I prefer the term Zionism because I like the emphasis on identity and on the bigger issues of what does it mean to be a people, what does it mean to be a historical people, what does it mean to have these historic ties, and I don't always want everything to be around the Arab-Israeli conflicts. When we talk about the pro-Israel community, I want it to be a big broad tent, left to right, religious, non-religious, black and white, which includes black Jews, Jews of color, and black non-Jews, and white Jews, and non-white Jews, and white non-Jews. But I also wanted to have space for a left-wing perspective and a right-wing perspective. I want it to be a big, broad tent, and that's my pro-Israel tent. And I rarely call someone anti-Israel unless they really deserve it. To be anti-Israel doesn't mean to be critical of the state of Israel, doesn't mean to be critical of Gil Troy. It means to negate the very right of the Jewish people to live peacefully and democratically in their homeland. That's anti-Israel, that's anti-Zionism.
How does Palestinian leadership then, and this might be a topic for another conversation, get that memo that people like you and so many that are, we'll use the word pro-Israel here just for the sake of, or the term, that many pro-Israel folks are actually pro-Palestinian folks. We had Noah Tishby here on the program, and she talks about the same thing as well. So presumably they know it, but is it just political expediency that keeps them constantly hammering the narrative that they're hammering?
Again, part of the reason why I want to surround the Palestinians with more peace process, with peace more, not peace now, with more examples of the ties between Israelis and our Arab brothers and sisters, be they within the state of Israel, be they in UAE, be they within Bahrain, is to show them that it's not all or nothing, to show them there's room for compromise. And I also would like them to learn a history lesson. Notice, Israelis compromise, not when they're under the gun, not when lies like Zionism is racism are being propagated by the UN, but Israelis are prone to compromise when their fundamental rights are legitimized, when they get love, not tough love from the United States, from the United Nations, from the international community. What's particularly interesting with the Palestinians is that they, to the extent they ever have compromised, it's when they get tough love, not love. And one of the mistakes that someone like Barack Obama made was that he gave the Palestinians love and the Israelis tough love. Someone like Bill Clinton gave the Israelis love and the Palestinians love. And again, I think it works best, if you look at history, when the Palestinians get a little bit of tough love and the Israelis get love.
We're going to send that message to everybody in your neighborhood there, Gil. Listen, I want to switch gears for a second because I understand you speak to birthright groups. What do you tell them that might inspire them? And what's your intended takeaway from your encounters with them, from your meetings with them?
So first of all, I not only have the privilege of speaking to Birthright groups, but I'm the volunteer chair, as you're a lay leader of JNF. I am the volunteer chair of Birthright, Taglit Birthright Israel's International Education Committee. And the message of Birthright is very simple to me. Welcome. Welcome home to Israel. Welcome home to the Jewish people. Welcome home to the Jewish conversation. Too many forces today in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, eviscerate a sense of identity, wipe out a sense of community, eliminate a sense of tradition. And I'm not talking about just in the Jewish community. And so what I say to Birthright participants is welcome. Here you can stop being a nothing and become a something. Here you can stop being so lonely and join a community. Here you can stop living in internet time, in immediate time, in CNN time, and start counting, as I said earlier, not just in decades, not just in centuries, not just in millennia. And here you can be not subjected to the Jewish guilt trip, which I'm sorry to say in too many synagogues you get, or too many Hebrew schools you get, but you can be captain of your own ship. You can launch your own Jewish journey. And so I really look at Birthright as a welcome. And I think JNF is doing the same kind of thing. We're saying this is Identity Zionism 101, that this isn't about the guilt trip. If you don't defend the Jewish people are going to fall apart. We don't need you. We really don't need you for that. This is about opportunity. This is an opportunity to go beyond the me, the my, the more, the now, the money aspects of Western civilization, and live in the past, seeing who we were, in the present, seeing who we are, and in the future, dreaming of who we can be. And to think eternally, and think communally, and think a little outside the box, and find fellow seekers. Birthright, Israel, Judaism, Zionism are, to me, meaning-seeking journeys. And what we try to do in Birthright is simply give people the gift of time, and the gift of Israel, and the gift of this 4,000-year-old conversation about values, about meaning, about community, about story, and introduce them to some of it. This is the greatest story ever told. A people who are the original Aboriginal people, still in love with the same land, still praying from the same prayer book, still building the same land, still speaking the same language. So many who were cut off for so many years, coming back and building, despite having lived for so many years in so many undemocratic countries, a thriving democracy, which is not just for the Jews who live here, but for everyone who lives in the state of Israel. 20% are Arabs. And look at the percentage of Arab doctors, 20%, almost exactly the population. Look at the percentage of Arab pharmacists, 43% of Israeli pharmacists are Arabs. And so are we perfect? No, but are we doing something really exciting? And is this part of an amazing story? Wow, I couldn't make it up. My books behind me are nonfiction, not fiction, because this is the greatest story ever told. And unfortunately, in too many Jewish homes today, the greatest story never told.
And that's why you're telling it. And it sounds like you're really showing them that they need to care about Zionism. And again, the beauty of Zionism.
Yeah, and open up and free ourselves from CNN and free ourselves from the New York Times and free ourselves from the guilt trips, free ourselves from the damage that right-wing Jews do with the heavy-duty politicization and left-wing Jews do with the heavy-duty politicization, and say this is an identity conversation. I also think this is Pilates. This Pilates Judaism 101. We strengthen our core, right? There's also what JNF is so involved with right now. And we strengthen our core, and then we can get to politics, and then we can get to back and forth, and then we can figure out who we are and what our boundaries should be. But first, we start with the core, our story, our past, our present, our future, our values, our traditions.
Now, Gil, you are definitely a Zionist advocate, and I'm just wondering, and an activist as well, was there one moment that was a bit of a tipping point for you, or have you been a Zionist activist all your life?
I would say I've been a Zionist all my life, but not an activist all my life. I'm the product of, I like to say, of a mixed marriage. My father was from Beitar, the right-wing Zionist youth movement, and my mother was from Habonim, the left-wing Zionist youth movement. I'm in a mixed marriage because I was in Young Judea, the centrist Zionist youth movement, and I married my delightful wife, Linda, from Hashem Eretz Yisrael, the left-wing Zionist youth movement. So we always had Zionism in our blood. And my father actually spoke to us in Hebrew. He gave me this weirdo name, Gilad. Try having that name in Queens in New York growing up. I should have been Gilad Troyansky, but he also gave me an anskiectomy, so there I am, Gil Troy, which means I get great reception in Greek restaurants. When I'm a teaching assistant at Harvard, someone with one of those last names is the first name, the first names are the last name. Richard John goes up to Gil Troy because Troy Gil could also be a first name and last name. He goes, oh, there are so few wasps like us around nowadays. And I say even fewer than you think. And I didn't take that as anti-Semitism. I said, wow, it means I fit in, I belong. And the kind of Zionist I wanted to be was someone who fit in, who could be a good American historian, who could fit into the woodwork as Gil Troy, but at home, build a strong Jewish life. And then almost exactly 20 years ago, when Yasser Arafat led his people away from the peace path and back once again toward the path of terrorism. And immediately everybody's blaming us. And I'm in Montreal, I'm a Yale professor. And I'm seeing all this ugliness. And I'm seeing the terrorism, this very personal terrorism. This is even before 9/11. This is 20 years and a half ago. In April 2001, I write an essay saying, I am a Zionist, in a sense, coming out of the closet. Learning from my gay friends, learning from my women friends, learning from my African-American friends, that if we don't affirm our identity, if we don't stand strong, we're weaklings, we're lost. And since then, I've been involved in affirming Zionism in a more activist kind of way. And it's been the great adventure of my life. And I've had an opportunity to meet amazing people like you and Russell, to meet amazing people like hundreds, probably thousands of Birthright participants I've spoken to ultimately decide to move and live in Israel, to write a number of books, as you were so kind to mention, about Zionism, and to invite people into this exciting conversation and say, enough with the politics, enough with the fight, enough with the guilt trips. Welcome home.
Yeah, and it sounds like you want Zionists to define Zionism for ourselves rather than other people defining it for us.
And that's national identity, that's liberal nationalism, that's human dignity 101. Yeah. Why should I allow someone else to define me? And why do we do that, right? Again, I learned that from my gay friends on campus, my feminist friends on campus. Take back the night. My African American friends on campus. They even will take some of the most ugly words in the vocabulary and use it internally to say, we're not going to let the other define us. So how can we run away from the term Zionism? You know, sometimes I'm told, oh, don't use the Z word. It doesn't poll well. And I say, well, do you think the American Revolution would have polled well in the 1770s? Do you think the Zionist Revolution would have polled well in the 1890s? Do you think the Civil Rights Revolution would have polled well in the 1950s? I'm sorry if it doesn't poll well. I'm going to take back the night. I'm going to redefine it, and I'm going to invite you to redefine it. That's the excitement, and that's our power, and that's our dignity as human beings. We can't let the accused define us. The accuser define us. We have to, as the accused, stand up and be strong and be proud.
Amen to that, Gil. You know, I have to tell you, I'm so glad, Gil, that you pointed out that some people want to use your last name instead of your first name and call you Troy Gil, because when I was preparing for this episode, I kept thinking to myself, I have to make sure that I get Gil's name right the whole time. So
it wouldn't be the first time that it got mixed up, so it's all good.
Your Professor Troy Gil or Gil Troy. Yes, there you go. Now, listen, you penned an article with Natan Sharansky, and it's Natan Sharansky, not Sharansky Natan, by the way, right. In June of this year. No longer
Anatoly Sharansky, if we're going to play the name game, right?
Yes, absolutely. We could call him Anatoly Sharansky. You penned an article with him. You collaborated, of course, on your latest book, but you penned an article in June of this year, 2021, for Tablet Magazine titled The Un-Jews. And I'd like you to unpack the definition for us, the definition of the Un-Jews. It was a fascinating article, by the way.
Well, thank you. Look, this is a difficult moment. We wrote this book, Never Alone. It's over 350 pages, and it's about dialogue. And it's about this big tent. And it's about the need for us as a Jewish people to know that whoever you are, wherever you are, you're never alone, and that you fit in, you're welcome. But when you have a tent, you're never going to have some red lines. Abraham had a tent that was open, left, right, east, west, north, south, but also had certain boundaries. Every community, by definition, a community has to have boundaries. And all of a sudden, in late May, early June 2021, when Hamas in Gaza once again starts bombarding Israel and bombarding the Jewish people, and then, of course, there's a surge of anti-Semitism, what do we hear from some Jews? That it's our fault. What do we hear from leading Jewish academics? A few of them. And from some rabbis. These ugly terms, Jewish supremacy, which is a Nazi phrase, I always say, just use the original German. Settler colonialism, which is an inaccurate phrase, as I said earlier. Racism. We see this petition of Jewish studies professors using these cliches, and we're in shock. We see all these rabbinic students calling out Israel, and we're in shock, especially at this moment of great Jewish pain. And so we write an essay, which is in a sense a follow-up from our book. It doesn't negate the message of our book of unity. But we say, while having a big tent, you also need some red lines. That's also that you use the keyword dignity. And so we said there's a small group of people who we see now who we're going to call out. They're not non-Jews, because they're Jewish studies professors, they're rabbis, some of them are religious. They're not what is called in England as a Jews, Jews who are completely from outside the tent, who only assert their Judaism to knock Israel down. They're not ex-Jews, because they're still deeply involved. They're inside the Jewish tent. They're leaders of the Jewish community. Again, this very small group of people that gets disproportionate attention. And what are they doing? They're basically involved in an undoing project. They're trying to unravel the intimate ties between American Jewry and Israel. They're trying to unravel the Jewish consensus since the Holocaust, since 1948, the State of Israel establishment, since 1967, that statehood and nationhood, this Oreo cookie, is so prevalent and so predominant. And so we called them out as un-Jews. And we said, those people are doing a lot of damage because they stand within the Jewish community. And then Natan, with his historic sense, say, hey, wait a minute, I recognize that pattern. That also happened during the Soviet Revolution, when yeshiva bachers, yeshiva boys, were in collaboration with the communist regime, and they understood from within how to attack the Jewish people and how to attack the Jewish state. And then I, with my longer historical imagination, started talking about what happened in the disputations in the Middle Ages, when we went back to ancient times. And we talked about how there's this phenomenon, not of anybody who ever criticized Israel, not of anybody who ever criticized the Jewish people, but a small group of people who again and again, the whole dor vador, generation after generation, tried to undo core Jewish assumptions with the conceit that they're saving Judaism from the ghetto. We don't need to be saved. They need to be saved. And we called them out in this article as un-Jews. And I'm sorry to say that we got three different kinds of reactions. The first reaction made us proud. It was people saying, right on, thank you. And they understood what we were doing, which was after your book where you talked about open tent and a dialogue, you're now hiving off a small group of people who really shocked us with their venom, with their vitriol. And we have to call them out. More sobering were leaders from the Jewish establishment who said, right on, but I can't support you publicly. Right on, but I can't say what you said. Thank you for saying it, but we're not going to back you. And most distressing were the attacks. If someone had attacked us reasonably, having read the article would be one thing, but so many caricatured the article. They said that we were demonizing any Jew who's ever pro-Palestinian, any Jew who's ever critical of the state of Israel, any Jew who's ever critical of Judaism, and that was just not true. Read the article and you see we emphasize 83% of Jews support the state of Israel. We emphasize that even among the 17% who don't, we're only talking about a small percentage from within the Jewish community who use their standing to try to undo the Jewish project, the modern Jewish project, the connection between Judaism, the religion, and peoplehood, and we call them out as un-Jews. And I don't take back one word from that article, just like Natan and I don't take back one word from our book, Never Alone.
Yeah, I want to read a quote from the article, actually. You wrote here, quote, "This small fraction knows exactly what they're doing and what they are undoing. They are trying to disentangle Judaism from Jewish nationalism, the sense of Jewish peoplehood, while undoing decades of identity building, all supposedly in the name of a pure, more universal, social justice-based Judaism," unquote. And that's from the article. The one thing that I still don't understand, I mean, you said it, and you explained it, but intellectually I don't understand it, is why they want to unravel this. It's for me, it just doesn't make sense.
Well, I think there are two different explanations. I think there's a sociological explanation and an ideological explanation. The sociological explanation is that after generation of being in America, they so desperately want to fit in. And especially when I look at these academics, so many of them walk into the academic lounge. And not only are they, like some of us on this call, bold, not only are they
say grass doesn't grow on a busy street.
They don't have enough room on their earlobes for earrings and enough skin for tattoos to show how cool they are, because they're Jewish studies professors, and that's a very uncool profession. So how do you show you're cool? You join the pile-on against Israel. You join this irrational demonization of Israel. So the sociology of it is joining the mob. And we've seen on campus today how there really is a mob mentality against Jews, against Israel, against Zionism. The ideological piece is that there also are a number of Jews, especially Jewish studies professors, and I'm sorry to say, a number of leading young rabbis who have decided that the Israel project is spoiled and that Israel failed by becoming too particularist. And they're going to save Israel, they're going to save modern Judaism with their universalism. Now, my mother warned that if you're too open-minded, your brains fall out. My mother warned that this is kind of a false guard of universalism. And I also want to point out, and we in some ways weren't sharp enough in the article to say this, that these people, especially when it's happening when bombs are falling, are not taking responsibility for their role in the chain of delegitimization, the chain of demonization that may start in the faculty lounge, that may start in some Yom Kippur sermon, but then actually feeds the UN and feeds the Palestinian extremists and ultimately causes bombs to be falling on their fellow Jews in Israel. You want to talk about a lethal form of anti-Semitism. It's not just the street mobs we've seen unleashed by the anti-Zionism that occurred after May 2021. It's not just the anti-Semitism that we see from the far right, but it's also the lethal anti-Semitism that feeds Palestinian extremism and that results in kidnappings, in terrorism, and in bombings. Take responsibility for the words you're saying. Take responsibility for the undoing project you're embracing. And don't accuse me of being divisive. I'm trying to have a big, broad tent with certain red lines. You're the ones crossing those red lines.
There was a quote also that I'd like to read from one of the pieces that you wrote, Gil, and I want you to respond to it because it's germane to the conversation. Quote, increasingly, many American Jews are happy being Jew-ish, reducing a profound cultural, intellectual, religious heritage to props, a smattering of superficial symbols to make us stand out just enough to be interesting and not too much to be threatening, unquote.
Look at what goes on in Hollywood. Look at what goes on in popular culture. Look at what goes on in so much Jewish humor. Judaism has to be more than lox and bagels. Judaism has to be more than guilt trips. Judaism has to be more than jokes here and there. Look at, by the way, the Pew Study. And when the Pew Study asks, what are the dimensions of Jewish identity that most define the essence of your Judaism? And so many say it's about Holocaust and humor and a little bit of Jewish food. I go, isn't there more to civilization than us being oppressed? Isn't there more to Jewish civilization than the old joke of they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat? And so, yeah. And again, as I say, it's sociological too. With each generation, more and more Jews become Americanized. With each generation, more and more Jews distance themselves from the immigrant experience. With each generation, they want to fit in so desperately. And so they become apologetic about proud Jews. They become apologetic about powerful Jews. They become apologetic about the state of Israel. And in order to fit in, they reduce Judaism to a series of neuroses, a series of one-liners, and a series of ethnic ties. Now, of course, this is a phenomenon that happened in the Italian-American community, in the Irish-American community. This is part of Americanization. And it's one of the great blessings of America. We can fit in. But don't fit in such a way that you sell your soul to the devil. Don't fit in such a way that you pour too much red, white, and blue into your blue and white soul. The beautiful thing about red, white, and blue is that there's room for blue and white too.
Yeah, well said. And that's going back to Birthright. One of the beauties of Birthright. We had Izzy Tapuchi, by the way, here on IsraelCast, the CEO, who just shared so much of the wonderful work that Birthright is doing. You shared a little bit right now. And that's really the beauty of that organization, organizations like Jewish National Fund, which talk about the beauty of Israel, talk about the beauty of the Jewish people and Zionism, and how proud we should be of all of the achievements that Israel has made and continues to make, as well as of the contribution of the Jewish people throughout history. And that's really what we should all embrace and we should all celebrate. I'm sure you wouldn't disagree.
in writing my book with Natan Sharansky, first of all, it's an amazing thing. I'm a product of America, the great shopping center, the great land of prosperity. He's a product of the vast prison camp called the Soviet Union. I spent the 1980s studying history at Harvard. He spent the 1980s making history in the Gulag. And yet we never had an ideological disagreement. We disagreed about all kinds of things. I think the two most chilling moments in all the years that we worked together were, one, when he talked about how he thought anti-Semitism was just a tool of the devil, a tool of dictatorships. And to come to American campuses, to come to America, to come to UK, to come to democracies and see that there was anti-Semitism there, devastated him. And the second chilling thing was to hear him describe the look in the eyes of Birthright participants, the look in the eyes of kids who come on some JNF programs, the look of the eyes who will end up in this beautiful Zionist village you're building in Beersheba. And to see the same look in the eyes that he saw in the Soviet Jewish refuseniks back in the day in the 70s and 80s. Why? Because he says in the 70s and 80s, they had been robbed of an identity by Stalin, by Khrushchev, by the communists, and now they were discovering something. That made sense. To see the light in the eyes of Birthright participants, of JNF participants, who've been robbed by their parents or by these sociological factors, and to see the similarity broke his heart, because it meant that too many of us are not being abused by anti-Semites, but buying into a form of undoing, of self-denial that is truly heartbreaking. But of course, both have a happy ending because we've learned how to fight anti-Semitism, and with Birthright, with JNF, with what we call identity Zionism, we're also learning how to take back the night and return to an optimistic, positive, affirmative Zionist conversation and Jewish identity conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm the eternal optimist, and it sounds like you are as well, Gil, just optimistic about our future. And as a historian, it's a nice segue into work that you did on CNN, because when I reread your bio, I was reminded that you appeared as a featured commentator on series that I very much enjoyed on CNN. You were on the popular multi-part documentaries, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. And with that in mind, I'd like to go back actually to the 1980s. And I'm wondering if you think Israelis in the 80s, Gil, could have thought Israel would look like the Israel of today in 2021 as we record this.
So first of all, let me just point out that it's a delightful question because it gets to my two identities, right? I always say my main job is being an American historian and writing about the decades. And I like that intersection of politics and culture that the CNN series so brilliantly captured. And I have this second parallel career and hobby and passion as a Zionist and Jewish loudmouth. So you're bringing the two together. I think my short answer would be that most Israelis wouldn't want to go back to the 1980s, and most Americans might want to go back to the 1980s. And what do I mean by that? In the 1980s, few Israelis could have imagined the prosperity, the peace, the stability, the comfort, the way Israel has emerged in the 21st century as one of the leading startup nations. It's an amazing thing, right? The amount of money that's coming into Israel in investment, the amount of startups that are being launched here, has Israel way ahead of Canada, which is a country 2.5 times Israel's size, and most of the European countries, which are 2, 3, 4, 5 times Israel's size. It's extraordinary that when we were talking about the fight against COVID, little Israel was up there with Germany and the United States and Canada and the UK in competition of who would find the first vaccination. And it could be that Israel might be the first to come out with a pill to fight COVID. So, and also, as I pointed out earlier, when we add the Abraham Accords, when we add even the stability that we've seen in the last few years with the Palestinians, despite all our problems there, when we see that the Arab armies that threatened us and that killed so many of our people in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are now quiet, Israel's far safer, far more peaceful, far more just, far more humane. I always say, give every country a directional signal and see which direction it's going in. And Israel is really going in the right direction on so many levels. Is it perfect? No, but we're way ahead. And we talk about the United States. Well, still, there's a lot of good, and there's still a lot of stability. I think in the 1980s, America was getting a feeling after having been in the doldrums in the 1970s, in a moment when America stood low and was humiliated by Vietnam and by Watergate and by inflation and by crime in the 1980s and then the 1990s under Reagan and then Clinton. So I'm going to be bipartisan here. There's a feeling of America's back. And there was peace and there was patriotism and there was prosperity. Now, I could make an argument that in many ways in pharma, in prosperity, America is ahead of where it was back then. But there's something missing today in America. That sense of unity that both Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan were able to tap into. That sense of optimism, that sense of looking ahead, that sense of hope that both Clinton and Reagan, and frankly, the two Bushes were able to play on, and that Barack Obama played on, has been lost. The sense of division, the sense of hopelessness, the inability to pull together, even in something like fighting COVID. Look at the split screen America we have. We have on the one hand an America that was cutting edge, led the world in ultimately creating the vaccine. Cutting edge has led the world in figuring out what protocols we need to fight the disease, but is really way back in terms of the unity. You know, we have PhDs here in Israel in fighting one another, but we've actually been very successful in not politicizing masks, we've argued left and right about what to do because nobody knows what the heck to do, but we didn't make it a left-right divide. And in Israel, things are more or less working. And in the United States, even when they're working, there's an ugliness, there's a division. So I think, and again, I'm being a little superficial or I'm missing some of the positives, that many Americans would love to go back and get some of the chemistry of the 80s. And I think there are very, very few Israelis who want to go back to where they were in the 1980s.
You know, Gil, I'm a trained sinologist, and throughout Chinese contemporary history, there were always these spiritual pollution campaigns. And I love that term, spiritual pollution. And I, in many ways, apply it to the United States, that I find that there is a certain spiritual pollution here. And there are a number of reasons how we got here. And there seems to be a sense of, I agree, hopelessness and unhappiness and anxiety here in the United States. And when you look at Israel, it always ranks very high in terms of being one of the happiest countries in the world.
Yeah, look, that's, part of my identity Zionism comes from my critique of American society. And I look at Zionism, and again, I don't have the arrogance that we have the best way, the only way. And part of the reason why I embrace Zionism is because it's my way. But also, I think that in Jewish nationalism, in a sense of pride over our story, pride over values, we have a solution, a response to some of those values. And when I sit and talk to my American friends, and I talk to them about the sense of community that we have, the sense of mission that we have, the sense of national unity that we have, the sense of purpose that we have, as Jews, as Zionists and Israelis, they're increasingly jealous. And I want to offer the Zionist solution, the Zionist RX, as a response to some of the challenges that we also see, for example, among our friends in the UK, who actually created a minister of loneliness, because so many millennials and so many Generation Z people, they call them Generation Z people, feel lonely. They don't have real friends. They have friends on Facebook. And Zionism, to me, is both a very deeply Jewish story, but it's also a response to the anomy, as Emil Durkheim called it, to the sense of me, my, more, now, us, money. We're talking about usness. We're talking about sense of purpose. We're talking about living, not just history where you say, oh, history is last week's most popular video of some baby crawling around and drooling or some cat rolling around. History is about the Maccabees. History is about David Ben-Gurion. History is about Golda Meir. History is about Moses. History is about Devorah. History is about Maimonides. History is about the great ideas. And history is about a people, sometimes up and sometimes down, who stayed together, who knew they were never alone, and who welcome people in, and who offer their story, not out of arrogance to say we're the best, we're the chosen people, but to say, we have a story, learn from it. Maybe it's an RX, maybe it's a prescription, maybe it's a response to the loss of faith the loss of community, the loss of identity, the loss of purpose we see in so many Western homes today and in so many Western countries.
Listen, Gil, as we begin to wind down our conversation, I'm super mindful of the clock, and I'd like to take our listeners and anyone that's viewing this on YouTube just behind the scenes, because we're 7 hours difference. We began this conversation at 6 o'clock my time, which is 1 o'clock in the morning Gil's time. It's almost 2 o'clock in the morning for you right now. And so again, I know you're a night owl, but I don't want to keep you up too much. Yes, there you go. I don't want to keep you up too much longer, but I just wanted to ask you, and we would love to have you back to continue this conversation. I'm just really curious, as a historian, has there been anything rather unexpected, and I'm putting you a bit on the spot, rather unexpected, you learned about Israel, the state of Israel, Zionism, Theodor Herzl, for example, that you were so surprised by that you either A, have not shared it yet, or B, it's something that you've shared with, for example, the Birthright group, that they were just bowled over by? Is there anything that sort of comes to mind of that nature that you would like to share with us as we wind down our conversation?
So 3 quick thoughts. It's a great question. First of all, when you actually think how many of the people who came here from Russia, from Poland, from Morocco, from Ethiopia, from so many corners of the world that were oppressors, and they're undemocratic. And the fact that all these people were able to create a Jewish democracy here is really one of the miracles of the modern world.
That they came from undemocratic
They came from undemocratic cultures.
So they didn't know about democracy.
And they didn't really live democracy. And lo and behold, they came here to the rocky soil of the Middle East, where there's no other democracy in the neighborhood, where they've been constantly under attack, and they created a democracy. That's a wow. Secondly, you mentioned Herzl. Actually, I'm in the middle of a Herzl project. We're going to be coming out a year from now with a new collection of Herzl's writings. And so I did a deep dive into Herzl. And one thing I really haven't shared with anybody is that prior to his writing Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, he writes a play called The New Ghetto. And it is a scarred, angry, negative play, not just about the old ghetto, but about those Jews who have left the old ghetto, made money, but still are the un-Jews of yesterday. Pathetic, materialistic, apologetic, weak. There isn't one positive Jewish character and positive non-Jewish character in his play, The New Ghetto. That's in 1894. Herzl's magic is that in 1896, within 2 years, he recreates his critique of anti-Semitism, and you can feel his contempt for the anti-Semites, for the broken Jews, for the weak Jews, for these new ghetto Jews. But he's found one other thing: hope. Hope in the form of saying, we are a people. Hope in the form of saying, we have a state. And so what he basically did was he invented hope. He created hope for the Jewish people, and that was Herzl's magic. And so when I tell the story of Herzl now, I had this new understanding that that's what made him different than all the other Zionists who were bubbling up at that time. And that's his great gift to us today. So we face all kinds of challenges today. What we can really learn from Herzl is that this guy in the 1890s, I was dealing with a deep disappointment. He left the ghetto, and they still hate us. Refuses to be a traumatized Jew, but is, as you are and as I am, an optimist, that he discovers hope in those years of great anti-Semitism and then spreads that to the world. That's a wow. So that's my second wow. And my third wow would simply be, again, pulling back and saying, what an amazing story, where the world is filled with so many depressing tales. The world is filled with so many challenges, and a story of a people who were so lost, who were so broken, who were so sniveling, who were so apologetic, standing strong. Not just as the American Revolution had to do, as the Russian Revolution had to do, as the French Revolution had to do, getting rid of the powers that be, but they also had to get rid of the broken Jew within. And to see 50 years down the line, 70 years down the line, now we're about to celebrate our 73rd, 74th, 75th anniversary of the founding of the state of Israel, to see the new Jew who emerged, to see the complexity, but also see the delight that we have, to see that we are among the happiest people in the world. What a story. I couldn't make it up, and I love to tell it. And it's been such an honor to share this story with you and your listeners.
Gil Troy, we're going to leave it right there. We're going to have you back to talk about your Herzl project next year, if not before. We want to thank you so much for sharing with us here your inspiration and your thoughts and everything else right here on IsraelCast. Thanks so much for joining us. And we'll have info about Gil on the show notes page of our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And before we move on with some housekeeping, I'd like to remind you that Jewish National Fund USA believes the time, as we've been talking about, has come for us to reclaim the narrative, take ownership of the word Zionism, and show the world how beautiful, inclusive, and inspirational it really is. So join Jewish National Fund USA Conversations on Zionism, Reclaiming the Narrative. As we said, it's a year-long series which will educate, engage, and inspire on the true meaning of the word Zionism and reclaim its true meaning in all its glory. So go to jnf.org/convos for more. Once again, jnf.org/convos for more. And of course, we do release new episodes of IsraelCast every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Simply search for IsraelCast. Don't forget to rate and review us to make it easier for more folks around the world to find us. Or you can always enjoy the show just by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. All right, now it takes a whole moshav to put IsraelCast together. And for that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Dara Shapiro, and Olivia Schendel. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is indeed powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more information about JNF USA, visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, we'd all love to hear from you. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz, thanking you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.